Good evening. You are listening live on the TV channel Culture, Radio Maya, Night Flight. I am your host, Andrei Maksimov.
Good evening. Let me remind our listeners of the live call-in phone numbers for Radio Mayak 959-1285 and 959-1287. Andrei, the floor is yours.
I think that people who more or less regularly watch our show know that from time to time we talk about, I don't really know how to call it, whether it is called the new chronology, or the new view of history, or the theory of academician Fomenko. We are extremely interested in an alternative view of history. I want to emphasize once again that we are not claiming that someone is right and someone else is wrong. We are simply trying to ask questions to which we want to receive a normal, logical answer. In the near future, we are planning to do a series of shows about this very new view of history with a person you all know very well. One of the most famous chess players in the world, Garry Kasparov. Good evening.
Good evening.
He promised to come to see us. He actually lives in Moscow, but travels often. Whenever he comes to Moscow, he'll drop by, and we'll talk about this very theory. Garry Kimovich, right now I don't even know where to begin or what first question to ask you. Because in fact, I see a book lying here, and I see a quotation in it that you read to me, and I simply can't resist. I really want you to read it aloud to our viewers, so that they too understand that not everything is smooth in our view of history, to put it mildly.
Actually, I think many viewers have probably read this book, just like you did, Gods, Graves and Scholars by Tseram. This is a famous German researcher.
It's something quite substantial.
The book has gone through hundreds of editions in different languages. I think that 10 years ago I would have read it too, without paying attention to some obvious things that today already seem absurd to us. It seems to me that the quotation I am about to read shows that if we reread certain works anew, we will simply discover that a lot in the official view of history doesn't quite add up. In my edition, this is page 148. It is a description of the tomb of some ancient Egyptian rich man named T. We see flax being prepared, reapers mowing grain, donkeymen driving donkeys, threshers and winnowers at work on the grain. The process of building a ship 4,500 years ago is illustrated, the felling of the trees, the cutting of the planks, the use of adze, hand ram, and paring chisel, which, by the way, were made in those days not of iron, but of copper. We can clearly see all kinds of tools, among them a saw, an axe, and even an auger.
Out of copper?
Out of copper. It is obvious that if one applies even a small amount of common sense, everything collapses. But one can also understand Tseram and other historians who find themselves in a dead end. Either there really was a copper saw, along with an auger and a paring chisel, or else we simply have to abolish the Bronze Age and throw away several thousand years. Because it is the Bronze Age, there is no iron, yet a saw is depicted. And we can clearly see all the other tools as well, which are made of copper.
A question naturally arises. Any reasonable person should understand that either one has to try to make an auger out of copper. That's possible nowadays, right? Is it physically possible?
Theoretically, it is possible, but I think no one would actually work with it.
Or one must understand that it's impossible to do, and therefore there is some kind of mistake here. Why isn't this being done?
It seems to me that we are, in fact, dealing with a rather heavy legacy of the past, as we used to say. These are prejudices. Things people simply cannot live without. It's a system of myths, a mythologized past which unfortunately becomes our present and our future. One can cite many examples where our very rigid attachment to the past cripples people's lives and even kills. Let's even set aside the Arab-Israeli conflict, which also flares up around so-called holy sites, even though no one has ever definitively verified what was actually there 2,000 years ago. But let's take a more recent conflict that threatens to escalate into a nuclear war, India and Pakistan. After all, much of it is connected with religious clashes. The Babur Mosque, on the site of which, supposedly 500 years earlier, in the 11th century, there stood a Hindu temple to the god Rama. I don't know whether it stood there or not, but in any case, I get the impression that today's politicians find it easier to burn tens of millions of people in a nuclear fire than to try to determine whether it was there or not. Because if we leave everything as it is and continue building our geopolitical concepts and new paradigms the way it's being done now, like this idea of 1,400 years of confrontation between Christianity and Islam, then we can just keep repeating this memorized text. But that means we are taking a database which, in my view, is completely unverified, unfiltered, and often falsified, and using it as the foundation for constructing concepts of both our present and our future.
It's obvious that history was rewritten to suit someone's interests. Why was history rewritten?
In reality, history is rewritten regularly. We encounter this in the 20th century, and we encounter it today. Today there are probably fewer possibilities for this, because information exchange via the internet and modern mass media makes it possible to involve millions, even hundreds of millions, in that exchange.
In fact, nothing is clear at all. Yesterday there was a violent clash in Moscow, and nobody knows why it happened.
There will be different versions. Now imagine that the need doesn't go away, because falsifying history is necessary. We understand that this is a very powerful weapon in the hands of the powers that be. People who accept that Stalin and Hitler managed to rewrite history in 2 or 3 years, for some reason believe that this was impossible in the 16th or 17th century. Or what? Did rulers back then have different moral qualities or stronger willpower? Were they able to resist the temptation to rewrite history? It seems to me that the time has come to bring in common sense and try to analyze past events based on the knowledge we have today.
Is it possible to make a saw out of copper? It's time finally to understand this, and there's a lot of this kind of thing.
In fact, it's not just about making something. There will be a great many such cases, because I believe that the first thing we need to do is stop treating history as a science. After all, science implies that its basic postulates are read the same way in New York, Beijing, and Cape Town. For example, the formula of water, no matter where you drink it, in Moscow, Kiev, Riga, or Paris, will be H2O. The boiling point of water will be the same, and the melting point of iron will be the same as well. In other words, we understand that the fundamental sciences have postulates that do not change with geography. But the history of Canada, say, will already be written differently in Montreal and in Vancouver. I'm just taking one country as an example. I'm not even talking about much more tense situations. We've taken, so to speak, a Western country, Canada, with its English-speaking and French-speaking populations. But take for example, India and Pakistan, or the war between Iraq and Kuwait. Or again, the Arab-Israeli war.
Let's take a call, and then you also have a quotation from Pushkin, who as it turns out, knew everything too. Please, Natasha, we're listening.
We have Vyacheslav on the line. He's a student at a technical university, but apparently, he has a very serious interest in history. Please, Vyacheslav, your question.
Hello. You said that I'm very interested in history. That's not quite true, but I do know Fomenko's theory fairly well, and I myself agree that.
Don't worry, just formulate your question.
I think that Fomenko's theory may possibly be closer to real history than traditional history.
And what is your question?
Here's my question. To what extent do you support the theory of Fomenko and Nosovsky?
Thank you.
It seems to me that today all these investigations are at a stage where it is extremely dangerous to take the side of another dogma. Because we do not have enough information to carry out a full reconstruction of past events. I fully agree with you that the main propositions of Fomenko's theory are most likely closer to the truth. But it seems to me that today it is far more important simply to pose questions, drawing on common sense and the natural sciences. That is, to demonstrate to the broad mass of interested people that the edifice of official chronology is a house of cards. Pull out one card and everything collapses. It will not be possible to reconstruct the past using amateur methods. This requires the support of society as a whole.
As I understand it, one of the most significant rewriters of Russian history was Catherine the Great.
Absolutely.
What was the most important thing she rewrote? Well, not personally, but under her direction?
First of all, documents from the 18th century, even those that are accessible to us, quite clearly show that by the beginning of Catherine's reign, the territory of Romanov Russia was very small. In other words, the real conquest of territory to the south of Moscow begins in the mid-1760s. It is precisely here that the young general Suvorov distinguishes himself. In essence, the builders of the Russian Empire should be considered not Peter the Great, but Catherine and Suvorov. It is under them that the Russian Empire begins to expand, and then, after the defeat of the main forces of the Horde in the so-called Pugachev War, the Russian Empire begins too.
What you've said is obvious to you. Now explain what you mean by the defeat of the Horde's forces in the so-called Pugachev War.
We all know what the Pugachev rebellions was. By the way, A careful reading of Pushkin's text allows us to draw certain conclusions. For example, when Alexander Pushkin wrote the ambiguous phrase, Pugachev fled, but his flight was worse than an invasion. Let's look at the geography of Pugachev's flight. After being defeated near Orenburg, he does not flee south, somewhere into the steppes, but instead flees toward Kazan. After a terrible defeat near Kazan, as we read, he takes Kazan. Then, once again, he does not flee from Catherine's main forces but moves toward them, crosses the Volga, and heads west. Moscow begins preparing for evacuation. A great many events take place that are impossible to reconcile using common sense. What is very important is that at the very moment the so-called Pugachev's rebellion begins, the Russo-Turkish War is unfolding brilliantly for the Russian army, which is literally within a stone's throw from Constantinople. Incidentally, as a result of the war, all the main fortresses have already been taken, including Izmail, which Rumyantsev captured in 1770. And all of this is handed back to Turkey. A peace treaty is concluded so that the army can be transferred back, and then these fortresses are taken again later and the war is won once more, 16 years later. It was clear to Catherine that the threat to Romanov Russia was so great that it was necessary to urgently recall the army.
To put it simply, in your view, and in the view of historians who share your position, Pugachev was not at all the leader of some kind of popular uprising, but rather the head of a certain horde state that was fighting Russia and had to be destroyed. And then Russia would have greatly expanded its borders. Put simply.
Absolutely. In essence, this was the end of an almost 200-year civil war that began with the accession of the Romanovs and continued until the so-called Pugachev War. It unfolded in different ways. There were quite active phases, such as the war with Razin, but there were also sluggish phases. Because even before Catherine, the territory controlled by the Romanovs was small. Essentially, Moscow ended at Kolomna. Beyond that, there was Belgorod Russia, the Vorotinsk Confederation, which did not belong to anything. That's why Peter the Great went to the Azov campaign via Samara, a rather strange route. In order to descend to Azov, he first made a sharp detour.
If you went straight, would that be a foreign state?
You couldn't go straight. When the horde raided Moscow, that was the horde road. It was straight, a direct route through their own territory. But Peter had to go around.
A call, please, Natasha.
We have Vladimir on the line. He is a mathematician and claims that he spent 2 weeks analyzing the mathematical calculations of Fomenko and Nesovsky and arrived at certain conclusions. Hence his question. Please, we're listening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Hello. I'm not disputing that there are a great many ambiguities in history. That's clear enough. But if one starts looking at Fomenko's works, say from 1980, which was his first publication, and then the subsequent ones, it becomes fairly obvious to any conscientious mathematician that his extrapolation is excessively far-fetched. I would even say, plainly incorrect. This has been demonstrated in the works of other mathematicians. So, why is the mathematical side, the very foundation, not being examined?
All right, thank you.
In fact, I don't want to give the impression that I am distancing myself from the work of Anatoly Fomenko. But it seems to me that for a person without formal training in mathematics, to which I count myself, it is improper to speak, for example, about a system of mathematical proofs. I have no doubt that Anatoly Fomenko can put forward many arguments in its defense. There really were many debates, and I have heard opposing views, but many people also supported this theory. There were many debates about astronomy as well. But for us, non-specialists in mathematics, it is rather difficult to analyze questions of stellar parallax. It's easier to talk about making a saw out of copper. There are things that are understandable. I believe that today we should look at the entire body of evidence. Suppose we want to examine some historical fact. It would be wrong simply to leave that fact as it is. Here it is written down, we take it and put it into our collection, into our conceptual framework. It seems to me that expertise should immediately involve several scientific disciplines. Certainly mathematics, of course, and chemistry. Most likely, some kind of linguistic analysis would be required. Probably the study of certain religious texts as well. In other words, key historical facts must be subjected to cross-examination. That is, we must conduct this analysis on the basis that a given fact must fit into our current, advanced understanding of the relevant scientific disciplines.
In Novgorod the Great, the word wallet was found.
The topic of excavations in Novgorod is a special one. As far as I know, in the so-called layer of the 11th century, a birch bark letter was found, on which the word wallet was written.
And what does that mean?
It means that this is not the 11th century. But in fact, the topic of the Novgorod excavations should stand apart. Because based on many indirect as well as direct pieces of evidence, it is already quite clear that we are talking about events that are about 500 years removed from the era that the initiators of these excavations are trying to present to us.
I, like most viewers of our show, have seen the film Gladiator. When you see all the power depicted in that film, two questions arise. If all of this really existed at that time, then where did the Krupp factories, roughly speaking, that produced all of this go? Or is this simply a metaphor of the director, and in reality, nothing like this existed?
Historians will tell us that, of course, there is exaggeration here, and that such technology could not have existed. Although I think that neither in the 17th nor in the 18th, and I'm not even sure about the 19th century, could all of this have been done. All these chariots in the form in which they are presented in the film. Unfortunately, it is precisely from such films that stereotypes arise, stereotypes that are instilled in us from childhood. The great, mighty Roman Empire, with such an army, such technology. Fine, show us where the coal was mined, where were the metallurgical plants. After all, hundreds of thousands of tons of steel had to be smelted, because the entire army, hundreds of thousands of people, had to be equipped. Look at how Roman soldiers are dressed. With each passing year, with each new textbook, more and more iron appears on them. Tell us how all of this was done. Show us specifically where it was produced. An empire can exist only within very specific parameters. We know what is needed. Banks, roads, maps, factories. Where was all this? How was it all organized? All of this works perfectly well for the film Gladiator. It was made in Hollywood today and that's it. But how could all of this have been produced 2,000 years ago?
This suggests that the Roman Empire did not exist 2,000 years ago, but later.
If such an empire did exist, then, in my view, it certainly existed much later. Because if we look at the development of science, major discoveries, and the history of technology, it most likely concerns the last 500 years. In that case, one can draw a fairly coherent development curve. It is clear that improvements were taking place and people were making new discoveries. Incidentally, from roughly the 17th century onward, one can clearly trace the duplication of discoveries. It is already evident that research is proceeding in parallel, and science begins to acquire a finished, systematic form. For example, chemistry as a science in its own right is less than 400 years old. And how could one have existed without chemistry? I am not even talking about the fact that in other sciences, for example in mathematics, there are only fragmentary elements. Take Diophantus, the 3rd century AD, and then, until Viet and Descartes, there is virtually no one at all. Everything else seems to have evaporated somewhere. It creates the impression that the human genotype changed. People did nothing, just slept and slept and slept, and then suddenly, starting in the 16th century, they began to act energetically, and everything starts to unwind in a spiral, as we are accustomed to seeing today.
Please, Natasha.
We are joined by Vladimir, who has a PhD in technical sciences. I will say right away that he has read your works, in particular those concerning the era of Catherine, and I should warn you that he questions your system of proof. Please, Vladimir, you may ask your question.
Thank you, Natalia. Good afternoon, Garry Kasparov. Good afternoon, Mr. Maksimov. A small question. Garry Kasparov, how do you manage not to notice such remarkable and officially existing original documents related to the travels of Vitus Bering, Dmitry Ovtsin, and Chirikov? These documents indicate that the territory of Russia existed in the modern sense, Eastern and Western Siberia, and even the Far East. Thank you in advance for your answer. Goodbye.
Thank you.
First of all, I must say right away that the history of the war between the Romanovs and the Horde Confederation was rather sluggish. At certain stages, it was certainly not a matter of peaceful coexistence, yet some forms of compromise were nonetheless found. In the end, both were the Russian Empire. It's just that both sides considered themselves heirs to the great empire. By the way, do not forget the so-called will of Peter the Great, which was declared a forgery here. In the West, it was feared, because it expressed Romanov claims to the entire vast Horde Empire, from ocean to ocean. Therefore, those voyages certainly did take place. They certainly traveled across territory that was considered Russia. The only question is, what kind of Russia they were referring to in political terms. There is a huge number of maps. You mention maps. Well, let us look at 18th century maps. Let us look at Russian, German, English, and French maps. These maps quite clearly show the state border to the west of the Volga. I repeat, to the west of the Volga. Even in official cartographic collections, one can find maps that clearly show the capital marked in Moscow, not in St. Petersburg. Obviously, such a map could only have been drawn by the Horde, who never recognized the transfer of the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg. In principle, I believe that an expert examination of the maps and documents you mention is necessary. It will turn out that if references to a unified Russia appear in certain documents, these are undoubtedly later insertions. Because the cartographic material quite clearly confirms that the state border was drawn in the vicinity of Simbirsk.
We have only 3 minutes left. It seems to me that a fundamentally important question remains, on which you could express your point of view. What you are talking about are questions that require answers. What was the saw made of, if not copper? Because it cannot be made of copper.
Only iron could have been used.
Why were all the troops redeployed to fight Semyemlyan Pugachev? Why, in your view, do official historians avoid addressing this and instead resort to name-calling when it comes to Fomenko, rather than engaging in a discussion? For example, by saying, the saw was made of such and such material. The troops were transferred for such and such reasons.
It seems to me that conscientious historians realized long ago that any attempt to answer even one of these questions would inevitably lead to a revision of all the established views.
Well, maybe that's a good thing.
Perhaps it is. For inquisitive people, this is simply a step forward in understanding the world. In this case, our past. But it is also possible that this would inevitably lead to global geopolitical changes that no one today can predict. People are afraid to touch the paradigm on which the modern world rests.
At one point, people did say that it is not the sun that revolves around the earth, but the earth around the sun. And everyone eventually got used to that.
Yes, but as you remember, the road to that insight was far from smooth.
Many people were burned at the stake. Natasha, we have only a minute and a half left, so a very short question and a very short answer.
To conclude, a very brief question from a woman, one that I hope will allow you to indulge in a bit of imagination. Please, your question, Marina.
Good evening. My question is this. If you, dear Garry Kasparov, had the opportunity to travel through time and space, which era and which state would you like to find yourself in? Thank you.
An interesting question, of course. I would certainly like to go somewhere far away. But since I generally believe that history is limited in time, I would most likely go to the 17th century. Perhaps to that century, which was a pivotal one. It is harder to pinpoint a geographical location, but it seems to me that a journey to any European setting connected with the 17th century would allow all questions to be answered. One such journey, and the questions, I believe, would simply disappear.
We've just finished this show. What do you think the reaction to it will be?
I think many people will become interested and will want to learn more. But unfortunately, as for the official reaction of academic historical science, I believe it will remain exactly the same. Let these amateurs say whatever they want. We won't get involved.
So, it's impossible to break through?
I think that once again it depends on public opinion.
Will anyone ever tell us where, in the Roman Empire, soldiers were actually outfitted and why the saw was made of copper?
No, because this is not considered part of the scope of their scientific interests. If a sufficient number of people appears, a critical mass, then they will be forced to respond.
I must now bring our show to a close. Summer is here, and it will soon end. I remind you publicly that you promised to come back and we will continue our conversation. I remind you that today our guest was Garry Kasparov. We discussed a new view of history. With that, I, your host, Andrei Maksimov, bid you farewell. All the best. Goodbye.